Chapter 21. Under the Stars. Long after the day drew to an end, and the sun had since transferred its place to the mighty beige moon to rule the sky, and its smaller green companion that drifted behind it, the overnight work crew had spent more time repairing the damage the village had sustained from the attack than actually adding to the defenses. Having now seen the destructive potential of the Bohrok with their own eyes, the Ga-Matoran were now clued in to the severity of the island-wide invasion. Although they were now more motivated in their tasks, the unexpected events of the day had shaken the established routine and hindered their productivity. Under the orders of Captain Jalla, the causeway was to remain dismantled now that it was confirmed that the Bohrok were not adept swimmers. Despite the fact that the village was now cut off from the mainland, and the existence of their reptilian guardian that prowled the bay had been made public, a sense of dread and impending danger was still very much present among the Matoran. Macku found a secluded spot at the fishing docks to escape the commotion of the work crew. She sat on the edge with her two-toed feet swaying over the 10-foot drop above the water as she stared up at the sky. She was far enough out from the light of the village center to hear the chirps and croaks of the local nocturnal rahi, and to get a proper glimpse of the millions of dazzling stars that spilled out across the night. She often found herself drawn to their beauty and calming presence, which was a common trait among Ga-Matoran. The Ta and Onu Matoran were known to look to the past for guidance and enlightenment, while the Ko-Matoran placed their focus on prophecies and dreams. But the Ga-Matoran were known to look to the stars for direction and teaching. Throughout their many unsuccessful attempts to discover new lands beyond Mata Nui, the sailors always relied on the celestial sphere to find their way back home. It never mattered if she had just had the greatest day of her life or the worst. The stars were always there at the end to greet her. Macku spent her time replaying the events of the day. From the first sighting of the Bohrok swarm to the two Lee Matoran that fired flaming arrows at her home. She had become so lost in her own mind that she almost failed to notice she was no longer alone. When she turned to identify her visitor, her eyes competed with the stars overhead when they brightened at the sight of Hewkii standing behind her.
There you are,
Hewkii said.
Why are you looking for me?
Macku asked.
Yeah. I tried the Turaga's house after I saw you weren't at yours. She said you might be here.
Sorry. I just needed to get away for a while. It's been more restless than what we've used to around here.
I see. I understand.
Hewkii replied as he was already taking a step back.
I don't want to intrude on that. We'll talk more tomorrow.
Macku's expression quickly dropped before she reached out to stop him.
No, wait! You don't have to leave. I'm sure you could use a break too, if you want.
Hewkii accepted the offer and took a seat at the edge of the dock. Just after swinging his feet over the side, he stiffened up when he looked out on the bay to see two enormous and unblinking orange orbs hovering over the water, staring back at him.
What is it?
Macku asked.
I didn't realize you already had company.
Hewkii replied with noticeable unease in his voice.
Oh, he's fine. He likes to keep watch over the bay at night, but he mostly just floats there. You'll get used to him after a while.
That's awesome, and definitely not creepy at all. Still, better orange than green, I guess.
Macku said nothing for a while. She swung her dangling feet a bit faster now that Hewkii was present. She had known Hewkii for decades, but only managed to sneak in short visits every few months over the years since her first extended stay in Ga-Koro, when he had hosted her in his home, mostly without the Turaga's approval. Their more recent interactions had been more eventful, having fought by each other's side at Kini Nui, and taking care of him while he was severely ill. And still, after all that time, she couldn't get rid of the persistent and bizarre feeling of exhilaration when she was around him. Even when she wasn't with him, she found herself thinking about him constantly, either reliving their most recent interaction or planning a way to make their next possible. Macku had no shortage of friends, such as Kodu, Shasa, or even Turaga no Kama. And his right hand, she had the opportunity to meet plenty of kind, noble, and fascinating Matoran outside of Ga-Koro, like Jalla, Kongu, or Takua. But Hewkii was different. No other Matoran had made her feel this sort of connection, which was made all the more perplexing when she considered how dissimilar they were from each other. Macku was soft, high-spirited, and expressive, while Hewkii, despite being generally easygoing, was rugged, straightforward, and dry. But these traits never seemed to clash, but rather complement one another. She was often worried that her unnatural fixation with him was an unhealthy one, as many of her friends seemed to believe, and that she would wind up pushing him away. But when they were together, it felt like the only natural thing to exist on the island.
You saved my life today, Hewkii,
Macku finally said.
That was nothing. Anyone else would have done the same.
But they didn't. You were the first one to react, and you even stayed behind to make sure I made it. I wouldn't be here tonight if you hadn't done that.
Well, I couldn't just let the Bohrok trample you. I had to do something. Besides, I had to make sure I got a few good hits in before Socket stole all the fun.
Are old planks of wood your new weapon of choice now?
Who knows? I've got to get creative until I can get a new axe. If I had time to pack before leaving home, I would have at least brought my Cooley stick.
Why not borrow a spear from the guard's armory?
Hewkii shrugged.
I could, but I've never been good with a spear. I've always done more damage when I can get in close. I'd almost rather keep using my hands.
Macku shook her head.
Just the thought of that makes me nervous.
I'm a stout Matoran, and I don't like to let that go to waste. I've done a lot of damage with these hands.
Macku picked up Hewkii's relaxed hand and compared it to her own. She ran her thumb along the chips and scratches on his knuckles that had built up over years of fighting, the most recent of which being the ever-so-subtle splotches of corrosion that ran all the way down the mechanical surface of his arm.
It looks like a lot of damage has been done to them too.
Sure, but just think of all the stories they tell.
Macku dropped her hand back to her side, but kept hold of Hewkii's.
Maybe someday you'll have more stories that don't involve so much fighting.
That'll be the day. I've never known much else.
None of us have, and that's not okay. But it will be. The Toa are going to stop the invasion, and we'll finally have peace again. Hopefully to last more than 2 weeks this time.
I believe it. I just wish we knew what they were up to. No one has heard from any of them in days.
At least we know they're still alright.
We do? How?
Macku pointed toward the brilliantly decorated sky.
Up there! Do you see those stars?
Yeah. They're hard to miss.
Macku smiled before explaining.
I meant those really bright ones to the left of the green moon.
Oh yeah, I see them. They're all different colors from the rest, too. I'm not good with constellations, though. I can't tell what they're supposed to be.
It's not a constellation. There's 6 stars, 1 for each tower. They've been there for years, but they didn't become distinguishable from the others until right before they arrived.
Wow. I guess I never noticed.
My friend Nixie studies the stars. That's her observatory on the outskirts of the village. She was the one that told me about them. As long as those stars are still burning, the Toa are alive, and everything is going to be okay.
Did the Turaga teach her that?
Maybe. She's done a lot of work with the Turaga, but she's also discovered most of it on her own. She's most of the reason we Ga-Matoran know so much about the stars.
I don't know much about stars. Except the red star, but come on. Everyone knows that one.
We can learn a lot from the stars.
I definitely like hearing you talk about them.
You should hear it from Nixie then. She's so much more knowledgeable.
No. This is better.
Hewkii and Macku continued to gaze up at the sky without saying another word. Barely more than a minute passed when Macku turned to see Hewkii fidgeting with the mouth covering on his mask. Just before she was about to ask what he was doing, the calming sound of the late-night waves was overpowered by the village bell. They snapped their heads toward the village center to see Captain Jalla swiftly approaching them.
"There you two are,"
Jalla called out.
"We've got more Bohrok on the way. This time from up the Huramafa."
What kind?
Hewkii asked as he and Macku were already standing ready.
"It's a mixed swarm. We're still working on a full tally."
At least they can't reach us now.
Macku said.
Will we be able to take them out from here?
We'll need something bigger than arrows for that.
Hewkii replied.
The gaps between their plating are too small. I doubt a Limatoran could even hit it at that distance.
"But a Limatoran can still hit us,"
Jalla added.
"If they have any more working in their swarm, we'll be trapped here."
Then let's go see what we're dealing with,
said Hewkii. Jalla took the lead as the three Matoran rushed for a higher platform to get a better view of the incoming invasion. They made their way off the fishing docks and across the bridge toward the village square, weaving past the gathered work crews and the ceaselessly clanging bell. They worked their way toward the outskirts of the village where they reached Nixie's observatory. The structure was built on its own platform, slightly more secluded from the rest of the village than the others. The building itself was split into two sections. The entire bottom section was a typical modest shack of similar size and shape to the average Ga-Matoran home, but had a tall and narrow addition built out of the back that led up to the upper section, which was a circular tower that was almost the same size as the base floor. From its ceiling sprouted the giant telescope that accessed all the knowledge Macku had just finished recounting to Hewkii, which was already pointed toward the nearby waterfall when they came to it. The door to the house was already wide open, and Jalla, Macku, and Hewkii rushed inside and scurried up the spiral stairs until they reached the observatory, which was filled with charts, maps, illustrations, notes, and countless texts on shelves, tables, and piles all over the room. Aside from Nixie, Turaga, Onewa, and two guards from both villages were crowding the room, awaiting the next update. The Turaga pulled himself away from the telescope when the right hands arrived.
"How does it look out there?"
Jalla asked as he strode across the packed study.
"See for yourself,"
Turaga Onewa said.
"That old lizard's gonna have his claws full with this one."
Jalla peeked into the giant telescope while the others observed through the open windows. The captain was initially disoriented by the power of the hefty apparatus, struggling to find the proper angle to view the relatively nearby waterfall, since its intended design was to amplify distant stars. He stopped searching when he spotted the sets of glowing eyes of red, green, and blue peeking up over the cliff beside Naho Falls, over the giant carving of the Kanohi Cow that overlooked Ga-Koro. The angle of the clifftop still made a proper count impossible, but he could see more and more sets of eyes peering over it every second.
Are there any Limatoran this time?
Hewkii asked.
I can't tell from here.
"I'm not seeing any, but I'm not getting my hopes up."
As more Bohrok eyes lit up the top of the cliff, an ear-splitting crack blasted out from the giant cow carving. All of those inside the observatory pressed themselves against the window to find the impressive and iconic landmark that had stood proudly for decades crumble into hundreds of tons of stone chunks that crashed into the bay, widening the waterfall and creating a chain reaction that turned into an immense landslide. A few dozen of the Bohrok tumbled off the cliff before they could back away from its collapse. The others began climbing down toward the already destroyed beach by the hundreds, unbothered by the small subtraction in their numbers.
Hafu just can't catch a break with these things,
Hewkii commented.
"Get down to the square,"
Jalla said.
"We need to be ready."
The group circled down the staircase and out of the house. They met up with Turaga no Kama, Kai, Kodu, and a visibly distraught Afful at the village square, as well as the crowd of hundreds of other gathered Matoran. They looked out toward the blackened beach, seeing hundreds more Bohrok continuing to pour down from the destroyed cliff.
That's gotta be 500-600. Have we seen a swarm this big yet?
Hewkii asked.
I don't think so.
Turaga Onewa replied.
It's hard to tell from so far away, but I'm not seeing any Matoran with them this time. Well, I'm not sure how they're planning on getting over here.
The Bohrok hissed and screeched as more joined them from the cliff and the old Fusa path. The aggressive commotion they generated did not go unnoticed by Socket. The gathered Matoran watched in anticipation as the glowing pair of orange eyes trailed a long and thin ripple across Naho Bay, moving straight toward the beach. The Bohrok were oblivious to the imminent danger they were placing themselves in, until the titanic sea beast ruptured the surface of the water and dragged himself onto the shore with his anchoring forelimbs. With a swift swat of his arm, he sent 8 Bohrok flinging through the air before crashing against their stunned companions. The one closest to his face tried to react, but was instantly crushed between the snap of his jaws. He crawled farther onto the beach, swiping his claws, chomping his teeth, and slamming his tail. With every single one of these motions, multiple Bohrok were obliterated. They tried to keep their distance, but the ancient Rahi's extensive reach was unavoidable. After leaving an embarrassing crater in their ranks, the Bohrok began to fight back. They raised their hand shields, releasing streams of acid and ice. Socket roared in pain at the increasing assault, stumbling back and writhing against the contrasting but equally agonizing sensations. He continued to smash through the Bohrok, but his attacks became less deliberate as the counterattack quickly overwhelmed him. He no longer had the desire to smash all Bohrok in sight. Instead, he only chose to focus on the ones blocking his path from the water. He hastily and desperately clawed a path through the beach before stamping back into the bay and swimming away in shameful defeat. Socket punctuated his frustration by vibrating the earholes of Ga-Koro a final time before escaping beneath the waves. Once they ensured the Rahi beast had fled, the few hundred remaining Bohrok gathered along the shore, stepping out until the waves hit the ankles of the ones in the front of the crowd. They stood eerily still while the smaller, unidentified creatures that accompanied them scrambled toward them, and each selected a Bohrok to tend to. The Bohrok remained perfectly stationary as the creatures flipped open their headplates and extracted the Kana inside. The Matoran squinted through the pre-dawn darkness from the village square to try to fully grasp what they were doing from across the bay. The creatures stored the extracted Kana into pouches on their backs and pulled out replacements. They planted the Kana inside the Bohrok's heads and closed their headplates before granting the larger creatures more space. The Bohrok that had been tampered with, which was roughly 5 or 6 dozen out of the greater swarm, began to float up from the beach. Now hovering over the water, they flew across the bay straight toward the village. The next few dozen moved up from the crowd to await their own Kana to be swapped by the smaller creatures. Jalla drew his sword.
Guards! Ready those spears!
The guards rushed to the front of the gathered crowd and prepared their weapons. Many of them ushered the villagers to retreat from the square, while the others took aim at the incoming Bohrok with their spears and bows. Once the floating Bohrok were in range, the guards hurled their spears, nearly all of which found a target, but only a scant few were enough to effectively take them out. Arrows were fired with similar results. The Bohrok soon reached the platform. The moment the first of them touched down, Jalla had already buried his sword into its chest and shoved its body over the edge. He started for the next one, but was thrown to the ground when it rammed its face into his chest. Jalla laid stunned on the platform as he tried to catch his breath. By the time he regained the strength to roll to his side, the rest of the Bohrok had already reached the village. He looked up to see Hewkii leap from the path of a stream of acid spraying out from a Levok hand shield, which very quickly ate a hole into the ground. Turaga Onewa used his hammer staff to bat away a Korok that tried to prevent Nokama from thrusting her trident into one beside it. The rest of the guards made their attempts to fight the Bohrok, but were forced back from the acid and ice streams of the Lavok and Korok. All of the Parok from the larger swarm stayed behind on the beach to focus on destroying the rest of the cliff. More Bohrok were being fitted with flight krana and hovering to the village. They got to work at sawing and corroding all that stood before them. The overcrowded village was thrown into chaos, which made targeting and combating the Bohrok even more difficult. Jalla knew most of the village would need to be evacuated before they could properly form a plan. Everywhere he looked, Jalla found an illustration of the futility in the defensive preparation he and his comrades had put so much effort in. As the Bohrok invaded Ga-Koro with seemingly no opposition, he gripped the handle of his sword and stood back up. He was sent to the village with a specific duty, one that he had every intention of carrying out. He would not let Ga-Koro fall.